June 10th, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, Normandy, France. The salty wind from the English Channel whipped through the torn hedgerows as the morning fog began to lift. The ground was still littered with the debris of war, shattered helmets, burned-out vehicles, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that hung in the air like a ghost. Lieutenant Karl Weber of the German Luftwaffe crouched behind a half-collapsed barn wall, his binoculars pressed tightly against his eyes. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Across the valley, a flat stretch of farmland near Sainte-Mère-Église, land that had been a muddy, cratered wasteland just days before, was transforming. American bulldozers, graders, and trucks worked in synchronized motion, like parts of a massive mechanical organism. Soldiers in dusty uniforms shouted over the roar of engines, guiding long rows of vehicles as they dumped gravel and rolled steel sheets across the earth. Weber turned to his sergeant, eyes wide. "Das ist unmöglich." "They're building an airfield." The sergeant squinted through his field glasses, his expression frozen in disbelief. "Not possible. That ground is still soft from the rain. You can't land fighters on that." But the Americans were doing exactly that. Just days after landing on French soil, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, specifically the 83 4th Engineer Aviation Battalion, had begun constructing what would become Advanced Landing Ground, A3, one of the first of dozens of temporary airstrips to follow the Allied invasion. And they weren't using concrete or asphalt. They were unrolling what looked like giant sheets of metal across the ground, interlocking panels, with a pattern of round holes, glinting under the morning sun, each section locked perfectly into the next, forming a gleaming path that stretched hundreds of meters long. Weber adjusted his binoculars again, trying to understand the technique. "They're not paving it. They're laying steel with holes." "What is that?" The sergeant shook his head. "Whatever it is, they've covered half the field already." He was right. Within hours, the Americans had cleared, leveled, and reinforced the site using perforated steel planking, PSP, as it would later be known. What took German engineers weeks or months to pair was now taking the Allies mere days. A bulldozer rumbled by, followed by men hammering stakes into the edges of the runway, marking boundaries for future aircraft. Behind them came supply trucks filled with barrels of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The scene moved with the kind of precision only massive planning could produce, and yet, somehow it felt improvised, raw and relentless. By nightfall, the first P-47 Thunderbolt fighters were circling overhead, scanning the perimeter. The Germans, stunned into silence, watched as the American planes descended onto the very field that hadn't even existed that morning. Karl Weber lowered his binoculars, still staring blankly toward the distant rumble of engines. "Incredible," he murmured. "They build airfields faster than we can destroy them." He wasn't exaggerating. For the German High Command, these rapidly built instant airstrips were an operational nightmare. They meant that Allied fighters could refuel, rearm, and return to the skies directly from captured French territory, extending their reach deeper and deeper into occupied Europe. That night, as the clouds swallowed the last traces of sunlight, the newly laid PSP runway shimmered faintly under the glow of lanterns. The sound of tools never stopped. The Americans didn't rest. They couldn't afford to, because tomorrow, this patch of farmland would no longer be a field. It would be a fully operational Allied airbase, and the Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, would have to face an enemy that not only fought hard, but built faster than anyone thought possible. Section 2. The Steel That Won the Sky. By dawn on June 11th, the impossible had become routine. The low rumble of engines broke across the horizon as the first wave of P-47 Thunderbolts lifted off from the newly completed runway near Sainte-Mère-Église. their propellers cut through the mist, their wings glinting in the pale morning light. Below them, the engineers of the U.S. 9th Air Force's Aviation Engineer Battalions were already moving to their next task. They had just finished a miracle, but there were dozens more to build, one after another, leapfrogging across Normandy as fast as the infantry could advance. Captain William Bill Hawkins, a civil engineer from Ohio turned Army officer, stood on the edge of the runway, his boots caked in mud. His men were exhausted, faces smeared with oil and dirt, but their spirits were high. He shouted over the roar of aircraft taking off, "Pack it up, we move east in 4 hours. Next site is near Carentan." To the men of the 83rd, this was just another day of organized chaos. Their secret weapon, the one that allowed them to perform engineering feats that defied belief, was a simple invention of wartime necessity: PSP, or perforated steel planking. Each PSP panel was about 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, made from cold-rolled steel. The rows of holes weren't for decoration, they were essential. The holes reduced the weight of the planks, allowed water and mud to drain, and gave the metal enough flexibility to contour over uneven ground. The panels interlocked like puzzle pieces, forming an instant surface that could handle the weight of a fully loaded fighter or bomber. The system was ingenious in its simplicity. While the Germans relied on concrete and months-long construction for their airfields, the Americans turned logistics into an art form. Every component, from the bulldozers to the fuel barrels, was preloaded onto ships weeks before D-Day. When the beaches were secured, engineers didn't wait for orders. They moved in like a flood of machinery, cutting down hedgerows, filling craters, and laying steel faster than the enemy could react. A typical German airfield project might require months of surveying, pouring foundations, and waiting for materials. The Americans, they could land a plane in 72 hours. Reports of this spread quickly through German ranks. In a captured field report from a Luftwaffe reconnaissance officer, one line stood out: "The Americans build airfields as if from the earth itself. One day, a meadow, the next, a fortress of steel and plain." Lieutenant Weber, still observing from his hidden post, noted the same in his diary that evening. "They arrive like ants, thousands of them, each carrying a piece of the war. Before you can aim your guns, they've already built the sky above you." That was no exaggeration. By mid-June, the Allies had already completed over a dozen advanced landing grounds, ALGs, across Normandy. Each new field shortened the supply lines, tightened the air support network, and gave Allied pilots precious minutes of fuel and range, minutes that often meant the difference between life and death. German high command tried to adapt. Luftwaffe bombers were dispatched to destroy the newly built strips at night, but the effort was futile. Even when an airfield was hit, the Americans simply rebuilt it, sometimes in the same spot, sometimes miles away, within a day or two. At the heart of it all were the unsung soldiers of the Army Corps of Engineers. They weren't as glamorous as the pilots or the infantry, but their contribution was just as decisive. Working under constant threat of enemy artillery and air attack, they dug, welded, and built through mud, rain, and blood. One sergeant described the feeling in a letter home: "Gens, we don't fight with rifles, we fight with shovels and steel." But every runway we finish means fewer of our boys dying in the air. The Allied command understood this deeply. General Eisenhower himself emphasized the importance of speed and logistics, knowing that winning the skies over France wasn't just about planes and pilots. It was about giving them the ground to take off from. And as each new runway took shape, stretching across the fields of Normandy like veins of steel, the Luftwaffe's last advantage, its defensive familiarity with the terrain, began to vanish. From above, the pattern was unmistakable. One by one, steel airstrips appeared across northern France, connected by dirt roads, fuel depots, and supply trucks. The Germans couldn't bomb them all. They couldn't even find them all.
Everywhere the Allies went, the runways followed, and for the German commanders, watching this relentless wave of engineering power unfold, it wasn't just the loss of territory that terrified them, it was the realization that they were being outbuilt, outplanned, and outpaced at every turn.
Section 3. Engineers at the edge of the front. June 13th, 1944. Near Carentan, Normandy, the thunder of artillery echoed faintly in the distance. The front line was barely 8 miles away. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, hundreds of engineers worked methodically under a gray, rain-soaked sky. Trucks groaned under the weight of PSP panels. Bulldozers roared as they pushed through soft earth, and the steady clank of hammers carried through the mist. Captain Bill Hawkins waded through the muck, clipboard in hand, shouting orders over the noise. His battalion had just arrived 2 hours ago, but already they had survey stakes in the ground and trucks unloading steel. The men were running on coffee, adrenaline, and maybe 3 hours of sleep in the last 2 days. "Keep those trucks moving," Hawkins yelled, pointing toward the incoming convoy. "If the mud takes one, use the dozer to pull it out, but don't stop the line." His men didn't need to be told twice. They knew the stakes. Every minute lost here meant another hour that Allied fighters couldn't refuel close to the front. Nearby, Sergeant Ray Dorsey, a wiry Texan with a cigarette hanging from his lip, guided a jeep through a shallow pit. "This ain't no engineering project," he muttered to the driver. "This is a race with the devil." And it was. The Luftwaffe still had the range to strike. Somewhere above the clouds, German reconnaissance aircraft were watching. By afternoon they came. The whine of incoming shells sliced through the air. A German 88 battery had zeroed in on the site. The first explosion sent dirt and steel flying, slamming a bulldozer onto its side. Men dove for cover as fragments whistled through the camp. "Medic! Over here!" someone screamed. Hawkins hit the ground behind a pile of planks, shielding his head as another shell burst 50 yards away. He shouted to his men through the chaos, "Keep low, don't scatter, get that caterpillar upright." And somehow they did. Within minutes, a group of engineers covered in mud, shaking but determined, had the bulldozer running again. They dragged the damaged panels aside, patched the crater with gravel, and went straight back to work. To an outsider it would have looked insane, men rebuilding a runway under fire, but to the Army engineers, it was a private later wrote in his journal, "We're not heroes, just stubborn. The Germans blow a hole in our field, we fill it before the smoke clears." By nightfall the site at Carentan was half done. Searchlights from the nearby front flickered against the low clouds, and the smell of diesel and gunpowder mixed with the damp earth. A jeep rolled up with a radio operator who jumped out, panting. "Message from command, sir," he called out to Hawkins. "They need this strip operational by dawn. P-38s are running low on range. They can't make it back to England." Hawkins looked at his men, mud-streaked, sleepless, hunched over the dull gleam of steel panels. Under lantern light, he took a deep breath. "All right," he said quietly. "Then we finish tonight." And so, under a cold Normandy drizzle, the engineers kept working, laying the final rows of PSP, driving in stakes, checking alignment by flashlight. Their breath came out in short white clouds, and their hands bled from the sharp edges of steel. At 3, the first test landing was cleared. A single P-38 Lightning glided out of the darkness, its twin engines echoing across the field. The pilot touched down smoothly, sparks flying briefly from the damp metal surface. The aircraft rolled to a stop, and the men erupted into cheers. One of them slapped the side of a fuel truck and shouted, "Hell yeah, that's our runway." Hawkins, exhausted but smiling, just nodded. "All right, boys," he said. "Get ready. They'll be landing by the dozen come sunrise." And when the morning came, that's exactly what happened. Wave after wave of Allied fighters streamed in, refueled, rearmed,
and shot back into the sky to support the troops pushing deeper into Normandy. Behind them, the engineers packed their gear, loaded up their trucks, and prepared to move again. Because for the Americans, victory wasn't just about winning battles. It was about building the path forward, one strip of steel at a time. As the first rays of dawn hit the PSP runway, gleaming like a blade through the fog, Captain Harkins turned east. Somewhere out there, another field was waiting, another impossible task, and his men were already ready for it.
Section 4. The Luftwaffe watches in disbelief. June 15th, 1944. Near Saint-Lô, occupied France, from the vantage point of a low ridge, Lieutenant Karl Weber of the Luftwaffe adjusted his binoculars. Once more, he'd been ordered to observe enemy engineering movements along the Carentan-Saint-Lô road. But what he saw unfolding below defied all logic and every principle of German military construction he had ever learned. The Americans had arrived at dawn. Trucks, half-tracks, and bulldozers poured in like a living river of machinery. Within hours, the chaos turned into precision. Crews marked lines, flattened terrain, and unloaded long rows of shining steel planks. Weber had seen their kind before, perforated, light and endlessly reusable, but never on this scale. "What is their objective?" asked Oberst Heinrich Müller, the stern, broad-shouldered commander beside him. "They're building another airstrip, Herr Oberst," Weber replied hesitantly. "But we bombed this area 2 nights ago. The ground was cratered." Müller lowered his field glasses, frowning. "Cratered," he repeated. "It looks level now." Indeed it did. In less than 48 hours, the Americans had transformed a shell-pocked pasture into a flat metallic runway. Bulldozers rumbled across the field, filling holes with gravel, while engineers locked PSP panels into place with rhythmic hammer blows. To Müller, a man who had overseen Luftwaffe base construction across occupied Europe, it was nothing short of sorcery. He muttered under his breath, "Our engineers would need months for a project like this." Weber nodded grimly. "They seem to need only days." The colonel said nothing for a long time. He simply watched as a convoy of trucks rolled in with drums of aviation fuel and crates of ammunition. Even before the final rows of steel were set, jeeps were already towing P-47 Thunderbolts onto the strip. Mechanics worked beside them, checking fuel lines and belts, preparing them for combat. It was as though an entire airbase had materialized overnight. When the first aircraft roared down the runway and lifted off into the sky, Müller lowered his binoculars, in disbelief. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "They've built a functioning airfield in less than 3 days, in a war zone." He turned to Weber, his face pale and tight. "No wonder we can't stop their advance. They bring their airfields with them." Word of these instant airfields soon reached the higher ranks of the Wehrmacht. Intelligence reports described them as mobile air bases, impossible to predict, and almost impossible to destroy. Field Marshal von Rundstedt reportedly scoffed when he first heard of it, calling it American exaggeration. But when reconnaissance photos arrived, showing vast sheets of steel laid across French farmland, each one supporting full squadrons of fighters, disbelief turned to alarm. The Luftwaffe, already struggling to match the Allies in numbers, now faced an even greater strategic nightmare. Allied aircraft no longer had to make the long trip back to England to refuel or rearm. They could strike, land, reload, and strike again, all within hours. This new mobility shattered the Luftwaffe's fragile rhythm of defense. Airfields deep inside France, that once felt safe, were suddenly within easy reach of American fighter bombers. Every rail junction, every supply convoy, every retreating unit, nowhere was out of range anymore. Weber's reports reached Berlin by radio that evening. His message was short, almost stunned in its simplicity. Enemy constructing operational airfields within 72 hours, using perforated metal planks,
continuous air operations now possible directly from beaches. The response came the next morning. From higher command, the Germans didn't just lack the material, they lacked the mindset. Where the Wehrmacht built for permanence and precision, the Americans built for momentum. Speed mattered more than perfection. A strip that could last a week was enough. By then, the front would have moved again. In that realization lay the heart of the Allied advantage, a war machine not just designed to fight, but to move. From their vantage point on the ridge, Müller and Weber could only watch in silence, as the sky filled with the thunder of Allied aircraft. Dozens of P-47s rising from a runway that 2 days ago had been nothing but mud. Müller finally spoke, almost to himself. They're changing the very nature of war, not just with tanks or planes, but with steel and sweat. Weber nodded slowly. And once they start building, he said quietly, there's no stopping them. As the pair descended from the ridge, the hum of engines rolled endlessly across the fields of Normandy, the sound of a nation engineering victory one strip at a time.
Section 5. Eisenhower's Secret Weapon. The Builders of Victory. June 20th, 1944. Near the Norman town of Cretville, the air smelled of damp earth and engine oil. Rows of trucks lined the horizon, headlights dimmed beneath canvas covers. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, or perhaps artillery. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. Major General Eugene Raybould, Chief of Engineers for the U.S. Army, arrived at the newly completed Advanced Landing Ground A-14. The airstrip was still slick with last night's rain, but it was operational. A perfect strip of steel gleaming through the mist, just as the first P-51 Mustangs descended to land. Standing beside Raybould was Brigadier General James "Jimmy" Casey, one of the senior officers overseeing the rapid expansion of Allied air support in Normandy. Casey smiled faintly as another fighter touched down. "You realize, sir," he said, 3 weeks ago this was a potato field." Raybould nodded, eyes scanning the horizon where bulldozers were already leveling terrain for fuel dumps and maintenance sheds. "I realize," he said, "and we'll need 50 more just like it before summer ends." That was no exaggeration. Eisenhower had made it clear, air superiority over France had to be absolute to achieve it. The Allies needed runways, dozens, then hundreds of them, built faster than any army had ever built before. Behind the front lines, the Eisengineer Command was now in full motion. Their job wasn't glamorous, but it was indispensable. Over 16,000 engineer troops, organized into specialized aviation battalions, were spread across Normandy, working in round-the-clock shifts. Their motto, borrowed from the Corps of Engineers, was simple but absolute: Ascensions. Let us try. And try they did. Supply convoys from Omaha and Utah beaches brought an endless flow of PSP panels, more than 100,000 tons of it, shipped from factories in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. Each plank bore the stamp of American industry: clean lines, drilled holes, and galvanization designed to resist corrosion, even in France's brutal rain. When the panels arrived, the engineers worked like ants, unloading, stacking, and laying them with a rhythm that became almost mechanical. But their secret wasn't just the steel. It was logistical choreography. Every operation was timed to the minute. While one crew graded and rolled the earth, another followed behind, laying PSP, while yet another established drainage ditches and fuel lines. Within days, a full-fledged base would rise where hours earlier nothing but mud and hedgerows existed. Colonel Thomas W. Carter, commander of the 81 19th Aviation Engineers, once described it perfectly: "We moved like the tide, silent, steady, unstoppable." When we arrived, the land changed. In London, General Eisenhower received daily updates on the progress of these miracle runways. His personal notes praised the engineers as much as the front-line troops. "Our victory depends not only on courage in battle,
but on the relentless hands that build the ground from which we fight. By late June, the results spoke for themselves. Over 40 operational airstrips had been completed in just 3 weeks, a record that stunned even Allied planners. Each one supported multiple fighter groups, close air support squadrons, and reconnaissance units. Now, when American and British infantry pushed deeper inland, they were never far from cover. The moment a town was secured, engineers were already scouting the next open field. Meanwhile, German intelligence struggled to keep up. Every aerial reconnaissance mission revealed new runways that hadn't existed the day before. Berlin's analysts were left scratching their heads. How were the Americans producing so much steel, shipping it across the channel, and deploying it faster than the Luftwaffe could react? The answer was both simple and terrifying. Industrial scale. The same factories that once produced automobiles, refrigerators, and farm equipment were now churning out perforated steel planking at a rate the Axis couldn't dream of matching. America's entire industrial machine had been transformed into a weapon, one that could build as fast as it could destroy. At Créteville, as another squadron of P-51s taxied into position, Major General Raybaud turned to Casey. "The Germans think war is won with guns," he said quietly. "They're wrong. It's won with logistics." Casey smiled, nodding toward the workers rolling out another line of PSP, "and the men who know how to use a wrench." At that moment, thunder rolled again, this time unmistakably artillery, coming from the direction of south. The front was moving east, and like a shadow following the light, the engineers would move with it. For the men of the Ice Engineer Command, every new sunrise meant another airfield waiting to be built, and for the German commanders watching from afar, it meant another day of disbelief. Because each new runway wasn't just a feat of construction, it was a declaration. The Americans weren't just invading France, they were rebuilding it, one strip of steel at a time.
Section 6. Steel Roads to Victory. June 28th. 1944, north of Saint-Éloi, Normandy. The countryside trembled under the weight of war. Columns of American tanks and trucks rolled eastward through the battered French lanes, engines roaring, treads crushing the remnants of stone walls. The smell of fuel and wet grass mingled in the air, the smell of an army on the move. Behind this armored tide came the engineers, hundreds of them. Their vehicles were different, flatbeds loaded with steel planks, graders and tractors instead of guns. They weren't chasing glory, they were building the highway to it. Captain Bill Harkins, now hardened by weeks of relentless construction, leaned out of his jeep as it bumped along the muddy road. His men, the 83rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, had been reassigned yet again. The next site was a flat ridge overlooking the Vire River. "Think we'll ever stop long enough to rest, Captain?" Sergeant Ray Dorsey called from the back of a truck. Harkins grinned. "Sure." When Berlin's paved in PSP, the men laughed, tired but proud. It wasn't far from the truth. By now the engineers' work had become a legend among the troops. Infantrymen joked that the Corps of Engineers could build an airfield faster than a cook could fry bacon. Pilots called them the ghosts with bulldozers. But the Germans weren't laughing. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, flying at dawn and dusk, reported new airstrips appearing overnight, their glinting steel surfaces stretching across fields that had been bomb-scarred only days earlier. The intelligence officers back at headquarters had begun referring to them in hushed tones as Eisenhower's steel roads. To the Germans, they were a nightmare, proof that the Allies' logistical power was something beyond comprehension. At the new site near the Vire, the Americans wasted no time. Trucks formed long lines, unloading stacks of PSP panels into neat piles. Bulldozers roared to life, carving the earth flat. Soldiers worked in pairs, laying panels end to end, hammering them into place with rhythmic precision. The rain came suddenly, a downpour that turned the dirt to slurry. But the engineers didn't stop. Their boots sank ankle-deep in mud, their uniforms soaked, their hands raw from gripping cold steel. They sang to keep pace,
Old songs from back home, voices echoing through the drizzle. There's a long, long trail a-winding. By nightfall, the first quarter of the runway was complete. In the pale light of lanterns, the PSP shimmered like water. A sergeant lit a cigarette, exhaled and said quietly, "Looks like we're laying down the Mississippi out here." Captain Harkins chuckled. "Yeah, except this one flies." Meanwhile, miles away, in a dimly lit German command post, Lieutenant Weber was once again giving his nightly report. Maps of Normandy were spread across a wooden table, dotted with black crosses, the sites of every newly discovered Allied airfield. Oberst Müller leaned over the map, brow furrowed. "They built another one?" "Yes, Herr Oberst," Weber replied. "Near the Vi. We destroyed the road leading to that area 2 days ago, yet they have supplies moving through already." Müller slammed his fist on the table. "How is that possible? The bridges are gone." "They've built new ones," Weber answered simply. "Temporary spans made from steel and timber. They repair them faster than we can bomb them." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the soft ticking of a clock. Then Müller spoke, his voice low and grim. "Every time we destroy the road, they build it again. Every time we destroy a field, they turn it into an airbase. This is not war, as we knew it." Back in the field, Harkins's men worked through the night. Their lanterns glowed across the plain like fireflies, dotting the dark with light. When dawn came, a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts appeared overhead, circling low. The lead pilot wagged his wings in salute. The engineers below stopped their work, just long enough to wave back, smiling through the exhaustion. Within hours, the first fighters landed. Dust and mist swirled around their wings as they touched down on the new Mechanics rushed forward to refuel and reload them, a seamless ballet of motion and precision. From the ridge, Harkins watched it all unfold, the roar of engines, the smell of fuel, the sight of his men standing proud beside the steel they'd laid. This wasn't just construction anymore, it was strategy made visible. The American war machine turning raw earth into infrastructure, logistics into power, and speed into dominance. As the fighters took off again, streaking toward the Eastern Front, Harkins turned to Dorsey and said quietly, "Every time they see those planes in the sky, they'll remember who built the ground beneath them." The sergeant nodded. "And they'll never believe how fast we did." The wind carried the sound of engines eastward, toward the German lines, toward the cities yet to fall, and toward a future being built one steel plank at a time.
Section 7. War by Logistics. July 2nd, 1944. Allied Forward Headquarters. Near Saint-Lô, Normandy. The sound of typewriters clattering mixed with the hum of generators. Maps of Normandy covered the walls, marked with red and blue lines, each representing the shifting tides of war. General Omar Bradley leaned over one such map, tracing his finger along a thin, curved red line labeled Via River. Opposite him stood Brigadier General James Casey, of the I Engineer Command, boots still muddy from his visit to the latest construction sites. He handed Bradley a clipboard stacked with reports, completion updates for 12 new advanced landing grounds, ALGs. Bradley raised an eyebrow. 12? You finished 12 airfields this week? Casey smiled faintly. 13, sir. One of them still being graded, but it's already operational. Bradley leaned back, letting out a low whistle. My God, Casey, you're building airfields faster than the Germans can count. Casey didn't laugh. He simply said, "That's the point, sir." For the Allies, the war in France was no longer about who had the better tanks, or even the bravest men. It was about who could move faster, and the engineers were making sure that answer was always the same. Every new runway meant closer support for the infantry. P-47s and P-51s could now loiter above the battlefield, striking German armor within minutes of being called in. Bombers could refuel and return to the sky twice as fast. Supply planes could drop rations, ammo and medical aid right at the edge of the fight to the soldiers on the ground. These airfields were lifelines. Private Jim Watson of the 29th Infantry recalled watching a fighter sweep in low over Saint-Lô,
releasing its bombs on a German convoy just a mile away. We cheered that pilot like he was one of us. Didn't even know he'd taken off from a field just behind our lines that morning. It was a new kind of warfare, one that blurred the line between front and rear, between builder and fighter. Meanwhile, the Germans were unraveling. Field Marshal von Kluge's staff struggled to organize a coherent defense. Supply convoys were shredded by constant air attacks. Bridges were gone. Roads were cratered, and every time the Luftwaffe tried to strike back, they found themselves swarmed by Allied fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere. In a secret report sent to Berlin, a Luftwaffe major wrote in frustration, "Their planes rise from the very soil they conquer. There is no place left that is beyond their reach." Back at Allied headquarters, Eisenhower received similar reports, but his tone was one of calm confidence. In a briefing, he famously remarked, "If the Germans wonder how we move so quickly, tell them it's because we build faster than they can retreat." The remark became almost a motto among the engineers. Some painted it on their trucks. Others carved it into PSP panels before laying them down. By mid-July, more than 70 ALGs dotted the Normandy countryside. Each one had its own code: A1, A12, A37, a vast, living network of steel arteries pumping life into the Allied war effort, and the logistics behind them were staggering. Each airfield required taking 2,500 tons of PSP, 20,000 gallons of fuel, 30,000 man-hours of labor, and a constant stream of trucks moving supplies, generators, tents, and medical stations. But the miracle wasn't just the quantity. It was the coordination. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, and an unbroken supply chain stretched from the beaches of Normandy all the way back to the factories of America. Every ship offloaded PSP onto landing craft. Every truck convoy moved in sync. Every engineer unit worked to a clock that never stopped ticking. The result: momentum. The Allies no longer fought battles in isolation. They fought as a moving machine, a seamless integration of combat, supply, and construction. Captain Bill Harkins and his men, the ones sweating and bleeding over those steel planks, didn't always see the bigger picture. To them it was just another day, another muddy field, another line of PSP to let. But at headquarters, generals could see what they were building: an unstoppable chain of infrastructure that stretched eastward, following the Allied advance like a spine of steel. At night, from the air, those runways glowed faintly in the darkness, hundreds of tiny strips of light and movement, flickering across the French countryside like stars fallen to earth. And in those lights, the German commanders saw the truth. They were fighting not just an army, but an engineered empire, one that turned every mile gained into a base for the next attack. General Casey summed it up best in a letter home that week. Wars used to be won by who could fight hardest. Now they're won by who can build fastest. Out here, that's us. He wasn't wrong. The steel roads of Normandy were becoming the very arteries of Allied victory, pulsing, expanding, unstoppable, and they were only just getting started.
Section 8. The Airfields that ate the countryside. July 18th, 1944. Near Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, Normandy. A grey dawn mist clung to the hedgerows, curling low over the fields. Bulldozers growled through it, their exhaust fumes turning the morning air into a haze of smoke and fog. The once quiet French farmland trembled under the constant pounding of machinery. For the people of Normandy, the transformation was surreal. Yesterday's wheat fields were today's airstrips. Farmers who once harvested grain now watched Americans harvest steel. Sergeant Bill Harkins climbed onto the hood of a Jeep, a rolled-up blueprint tucked under his arm. Around him, hundreds of engineers worked in organized chaos, graders leveling dirt, crews hammering in PSP panels, trucks unloading barrels of aviation fuel. A small sign staked in the mud read simply, A21, operational by July 19. The pace was unrelenting. As the sun rose, the metallic clatter of perforated steel planking echoed for miles. Every clang meant another section complete. Every section complete meant another fighter wing. One step closer to the front. Nearby, Captain Harold Red McConnell of the 3062nd Fighter Group watched his men refuel their P-47 Thunderbolts on the newly finished runway. It wasn't pretty. Mud splashed up on the landing gear, and the surface shimmered under the morning heat. But it worked. Ugly as sin, he muttered to his crew chief. But it gets us in the air. A few minutes later, the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines filled the valley. One by one, the P-47s thundered down the PSP runway, their tires spitting mud and steam, lifting into the air to hunt German convoys just beyond Caen. For the engineers, it was a sight worth every bruise and blister. They cheered as each plane took off, not out of pride but relief. The airfield had worked. The system had held. Meanwhile, just 20 miles east, German commanders watched the same scene through binoculars from a shattered farmhouse. Colonel Ernst von Keller of the Luftwaffe's 2nd Air Division couldn't believe what he was seeing.
"Mein Gott, they built this yesterday," he whispered to his adjutant. "Do they have a factory hidden under the earth?" His adjutant said nothing. The colonel lowered his glasses and exhaled slowly. "They are fighting with engineers," he said at last. "Not soldiers." He was right, and that realization terrified the German command. The Wehrmacht's own engineers, the Pionieri, were brave and skilled, but they lacked the sheer industrial momentum the Americans carried with them. Germany's airfields took weeks to prepare, often requiring rail-delivered concrete and heavy equipment that was increasingly unavailable under Allied bombing. The Americans, by contrast, brought their factories with them. Each engineer aviation battalion was a mobile construction company. Within its ranks were carpenters, welders, surveyors, electricians, mechanics and supply clerks, all trained to move, build and rebuild under fire. They traveled with bulldozers, graders, dump trucks, and even portable sawmills, and when they ran out of PSP, they recycled it, pulling up damaged panels, straightening them with sledgehammers, and laying them again. The ingenuity didn't stop there. To keep the runways from sinking into the soft French soil, engineers invented makeshift drainage systems using crushed stone and perforated pipes. They used empty fuel drums as foundation rollers. Some even experimented with bitumen and sand mixtures to seal the PSP against mud. Every problem had a solution. Every delay had a workaround. In less than 2 months after D-Day, the Allies had built over 85 operational airfields across Normandy, from Quarantine to Cherbourg. Each airfield served not just as a launch pad for aircraft, but as a small town of war. There were tents for pilots, kitchens for hot meals, medical stations, radio shacks and fuel dumps. Truck convoys brought ammunition daily. Mechanics worked through the night under the glare of floodlights, repairing planes damaged in combat. And always, the engineers kept moving. Even as some airfields were completed, others were being dismantled. The PSP stripped up, loaded back on trucks, and moved closer to the front lines. Nothing stood still for long. By August, the engineers had perfected what they called the leapfrog method. As the infantry advanced, one battalion would begin construction on the next site, while another wrapped up the previous one. The result was a constant forward motion, a rolling wave of construction that mirrored the Allied advance toward Paris. To the Germans, it seemed almost supernatural. Intercepted intelligence reports spoke of American ghost airfields, sites that appeared overnight where none had existed before. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots were ordered to confirm them, but by the time they arrived, the fields were already operational. One captured German pilot, interrogated near Saint-Lô, told his American captors, "We thought you had hundreds of airfields already waiting for you in France. We never imagined you were building them while fighting us." His disbelief was genuine and widespread. The speed of the Allied engineers wasn't just tactical, it was psychological warfare. It demoralized the enemy, proving that the Americans could not only fight, but outbuild their foes at every turn. By midsummer, even the French villagers began calling the engineers les bâtisseurs de tonnerre, the builders of thunder. And thunder, indeed, followed wherever they went. The rolling roar of engines, the pounding of hammers, the endless rhythm of progress marching. Little did anyone realize that these humble steel airfields would soon play a decisive role in one of the most pivotal operations of the war, the breakout from Normandy. The engineers had laid the groundwork, literally, for the storm that was about to be unleashed.
Section 9. The Steel Runways of Victory. August 1st, 1944, near Perrières, Normandy. The morning sky was alive with motion. Dust rose in pale columns as convoys of jeeps, trucks, and bulldozers rumbled eastward. Above them, the low thunder of engines echoed, not from the ground this time, but from hundreds of Allied aircraft streaking overhead. The Normandy breakout, Operation Cobra, had begun, and at its foundation, quite literally, lay the work of the engineers. The previous night, the men of the 19th Engineer Aviation Battalion had labored without rest to finish Advanced Landing Ground, A44. As they hammered the last PSP sheets into place, the rumble of distant artillery rolled across the plains. They knew something big was coming. By dawn, it was no longer distant. The horizon was on fire. Columns of smoke rose from the German lines as wave after wave of American bombers unleashed devastation. The ground trembled, the air shimmered with heat. Sergeant Bill Harkins, covered in mud and sweat, stood beside the runway and watched as squadron after squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts took off, their propellers slicing through the smoky air. Each one roared down the newly finished PSP strip, lifted into the haze, and vanished toward the front. Minutes later, the faint rumble of explosions rolled back over the fields. A lieutenant nearby grinned and clapped Harkins on the shoulder. "See that, Sergeant? That's what we built this for." Harkins just nodded. For weeks they had dug, welded, and hauled without pause. Now, at last, they were seeing the payoff, air power unleashed at full force. Behind them, the field buzzed with activity. Fuel trucks, lined up beside drums marked 100 octane. Mechanics scrambled to reload rockets and machine guns, and ambulances idled near the edge of the strip, waiting for the wounded pilots who would inevitably return. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, the kind that wins wars. To the men in the air, these runways were lifelines. Many pilots would later say they survived because of the proximity of the ALGs. If they were hit or running low on fuel, there was always a strip nearby, a ribbon of steel in the mud, built by hands they'd never seen. Meanwhile, German forces were breaking apart. The Allied airfields made sure of it. With fighters now operating directly from Normandy soil, the Luftwaffe's limited air response was crushed before it even began. Any attempt to launch reinforcements or supply convoys was shredded by swarms of Allied aircraft that seemed to materialize from every direction. Colonel Ernst von Keller, the same Luftwaffe officer who had watched the Americans build at Saint-Diquier-du-Mont, now found himself retreating east with his division. He wrote in his diary that night, "They are not men, they are machines. Wherever we fall back, there is already an airfield waiting for us. It is as if the ground itself fights for them." By mid-August, the Allies had advanced nearly 200 miles. The engineers kept pace, leapfrogging eastward, building new airfields faster than maps could be updated. Some units began experimenting with temporary tarmac materials, sand, oil, and fiber mats, when PSP ran low. Others adapted local roads and fields, blending American ingenuity with French terrain. No two airfields looked exactly alike, yet all shared one trait: efficiency. Each could be assembled in 36 to 72 hours, used for weeks, and then dismantled and moved forward. It was mobile warfare in its purest form, not just armies advancing, but infrastructure itself marching with them. General Eisenhower, upon visiting one of the forward strips near Avranches, was astonished. He shook the hands of mud-streaked engineers and told them it became a badge of honor, wings on the ground. But for the engineers, the work was never glamorous. They built under sniper fire, in fields riddled with mines, in rain that turned earth to glue. They slept little,
ate whatever came in ration tins, and often worked by the light of burning towns. Yet morale stayed high. Each man knew that every plank laid meant one more pilot would make it home, one more soldier would get cover from above, one more step toward victory, and the results spoke for themselves. By the end of August 1944, the Allies had constructed 22 airfields in France, an unprecedented feat in military history, each one a symbol of American logistics, industrial might, and determination. Captured German reports later revealed the shock among enemy commanders. One report from the 7th Army stated, even when bombed or strafed, the Americans repaired their airstrips within hours. Damaged PSP was replaced, craters filled, and operations resumed almost immediately. It was a perfect demonstration of the U.S. Army's philosophy, flexibility through engineering. As one engineer officer wrote in his journal, "The front line may move, but our work never stops. We are the line that follows victory." By September, the engineers had followed that line all the way to Paris. The thunder of bulldozers and hammers had become the soundtrack of liberation, and in the minds of German commanders, men who had once believed themselves masters of efficiency, one truth now echoed: the Americans had outbuilt, outpaced, and outlasted them.
Section 10. The Legacy of Steel and Sweat. September 5th, 1944. Just outside Paris, France, the sun rose over a city scarred by war. Smoke drifted lazily from broken rooftops, and the distant rumble of artillery still echoed faintly from the outskirts. But along the rolling fields and open plains outside the city, the sound of another kind of work filled the air. The steady clank of steel, the hum of engines, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Lieutenant Karl Weber, now captured and under Allied supervision, observed silently from the edge of one of the newest airfields. The Germans had retreated, their lines collapsing under relentless pressure. He could see American engineers moving with a determination that left no room for doubt. They were unstoppable. These men, they fight without rifles, he whispered to a fellow officer beside him, eyes fixed on the field, and yet they conquer faster than any army I've known. The observation was accurate. Across France, over 140 advanced landing grounds had been laid down since D-Day. Entire towns of airfields had sprouted from mud, farmland, and rubble, each a testament to human ingenuity, discipline, and sheer willpower. Captain Bill Harkins stood at the center of the airfield near Melun, surveying the work. PSP gleamed in the early morning light, planes taxied across the smooth metal, and supply trucks rumbled steadily toward the front. Harkins wiped mud from his brow and smiled faintly. "We didn't just build runways," he said to Sergeant Ray Dorsey. "We built the future," and it was true. These temporary airstrips had become more than infrastructure. They were the backbone of the Allied advance. Fighters took off to strafe retreating German columns. Bombers landed to reload in hours instead of days. Medics transported wounded soldiers directly from the front lines. Each airfield extended the reach of the Allied forces, making the next objective closer, faster, and more achievable. Even German officers could not deny the impact. Oberst Müller, in a captured communiqué, wrote bitterly, "Every field we attempt to neutralize is already in use. The enemy moves with the land itself. It is a new form of warfare, and we are unprepared." The lessons of Normandy were clear. Modern warfare was no longer fought only with courage and firepower. It was fought with speed, logistics, and engineering genius. In the months that followed, the engineers of the IAC Engineer Command and their counterparts became legend. Veterans of the PSP airfields would later speak of nights spent under artillery fire, of hands blistered from hammering steel, and of the exhilaration of seeing the first fighter roar off a runway they had built from nothing. Yet they remained humble. They rarely took credit. Their work was quiet, essential, and relentless. Even today, military historians point to those Normandy airfields as a turning point in modern warfare.
They demonstrated that mobility and engineering could redefine strategy, that the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy was as decisive as winning a battle. For the German commanders who witnessed it, disbelief turned to respect. Albeit too late, they had underestimated the speed and efficiency of the American war machine. They had watched entire airfields rise from nothing, seemingly overnight, and realized they were outmatched, not only in firepower, but in ingenuity, logistics, and the will to build. As the sun set over Normandy, the last PM-51 of the day touched down on a gleaming PSP runway. The engineers, covered in ardent sweat, paused to watch. They knew their work would continue. New fields awaited further east, new victories to support. But for a moment they allowed themselves a rare satisfaction. They had built the very ground of Allied victory, and the world would never forget how fast, how efficient, and how relentless the Americans had been.